BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, the English farmers rethinking the future as the government halts applications to a major environmental scheme.
We're sort of sitting here trying to plan our businesses based on a sort of vague assurance that SFI will come back in some guise, but perhaps not for about 12 months.
Well, today we're looking at the government's decision to close the Sustainable Farming Incentive, the SFI, to new applicants with immediate effect. The SFI is a major part of the post-Brexit system of farm payments in England. And just to be clear, this is just England. The devolved governments in the other nations of the UK are developing their own schemes and, in the meantime, retain direct payments to farmers. In England, those basic payments, BPS, are already being phased out and replaced by environmental payments. The Sustainable Farming Incentive is one of those new schemes. It offered a range of options like improving soils, planting hedges or providing habitat for wildlife, for which farmers are paid. Well, when it was introduced in 2022, ministers talked of getting 70% of farmers and 70% of farmland involved. As it's turned out, it had a bit of a rocky start, with criticisms of both the options available and the rates of payment for them. In response, the scheme has evolved, and more farmers have applied, with Defra says about half now in SFI. And perhaps that has been the issue. Defra says the budget has been successfully allocated, and so no new applications will now be accepted. Details on a new SFI will be announced in the summer, but applications may not reopen until next year. Tom Bradshaw, president of the National Farmers Union, told me the news is a shattering blow.
For so many farmers across the country, Charlotte, they have no ability now to get any of the money back which has been taken away from them with the dramatic cuts in BPS. This is leaving a massive cash flow hole in their businesses, and many of them don't know how they're possibly going to fill that.
You can't be that surprised. This was an uncapped scheme, and many farmers are making a lot of money out of it.
We're hugely surprised, Charlotte, because of the very steep cuts to the BPS. That money was to be allocated to the Sustainable Farming Incentive. The story was that farmers would be able to transition and would be able to access that money through the new schemes. And the SFI scheme, the Sustainable Farming Incentive, has been shut with no warning, with no consultation. And it leaves many farmers with open applications that aren't able to press the send button to access that scheme, to deliver for the environment and underpin the sustainability of their business.
The government, though, will say people have had some years to try and get onto this scheme if that's what they wanted to do, and the budget is finite, and because it's proved so popular, they've run out of money.
I mean, I just believe the scheme has been designed without the correct checks and balances in place. First of all, we had a massive underspend. Now we're seeing a massive overspend. I mean, it feels to me like it's been set up for failure from the start, and it's overly complex. But we've got many farms that were waiting for the end of countryside stewardship agreements, and they were then going to apply for the Sustainable Farming Incentive when they, to try and have one agreement in place rather than multiple agreements.
For those people who've been on an old stars scheme that you mentioned, countryside stewardship, which supported them in farming in a more environmentally friendly way, once that ends, what are their options?
They're just going to plough the fields up, plough the margins up, and they will just get on and try and produce food and make a profit from it. They've got no other options because they've got no ability to access any additional funding. And so that land, which has been delivering for the environment, in many cases for a decade or more, will now be, it's not being valued by the government. It's not being valued by any of the schemes. And those farmers are, really feeling the pinch financially. So what else are they supposed to do?
Tom Bradshaw there from the NFU. Well, this week we're looking at agriculture from the perspective of the people farmers call in when they need a specialist job doing, the contractors. It can often be more cost effective for a farmer to use a contractor for sowing, drilling a crop, or spraying it to control pests or diseases, or harvesting it. And this is where the SFI has been having an impact, as it's been encouraging farmers to grow different crops. Well, earlier this week, before its closure, Sarah Swadling met Chris Gardner, Vice Chair of the National Association of Agricultural Contractors, who works for farmers in Devon.
It's been very beneficial to us because with this drill being our mainstay during the summer, it is ideal for delivering one or two of the options available through the SFI, primarily the herbal layers options, which are designed to get herbs and legumes into an existing grass sward to offer natural nitrogen fixing in place of inorganic fertilisers. And obviously that's a very attractive thing, and it's got huge environmental benefits.
Adjustment to the different choices farmers are making has been tougher for some contractors in the arable crop growing east of England.
Over the last 3 years, we'll have lost 2/3 of the work that we were doing for purely whole farm operations. So where we go in the autumn, we do the cultivations or the drilling, we then do the spraying and the fertiliser spreading, and then we do the combining.
Matt Redman is a contractor and farmer on the Cambridgeshire-Bedfordshire border. He's also current chair of the National Association of Agricultural Contractors.
SFI has given people a way out of 2 very difficult autumns with wet weather, challenging crop prices and essentially low profitability and high risk of growing combinable crops. And as such, we're probably doing more out of season crop planting work, but the big sort of machinery jobs that we've got in the yard that keep the people employed and keep the machinery turning are reduced.
What are people planting instead to get the sustainable farming incentive money?
Some have gone for herbal lays, some have gone for sort of overwinter cover crops, and then gone into a spring crop, which changes the sort of the dynamic of the work available, really. And a lot of overwintered bird food, and they are taking crop production out from food and putting it into the environment. And we can see why it's happening, and actually the result and what it's trying to deliver to the environment is actually a positive. It's a strange one because it is affecting the bottom line, but it's not wasted.
Sarah Swaddling there on SFI's impact on contractors. Well, the closure of the scheme to new applicants will also have an effect, of course, and not just on farming. The SFI is an environmental payment scheme, and environmental groups are unimpressed. The Wildlife Trust says its closure means essential funding for nature-friendly farming practices is no longer accessible to farmers. Chief Executive Craig Bennett.
Well, we understand at the Wildlife Trust that it's probably right to be reviewing the SFI scheme. It needs to be, it clearly needs to be strengthened and better targeted to be made more ambitious over time. And we think at times too much money is going to some of the farmers that are commercially successful and might actually not need quite such generous payment rates, and in fact much more money should be going to more farmers working on more marginal land that perhaps could deliver even more for nature with the right support in place.
But if those big farmers, commercial farmers, are delivering for nature because they're part of the scheme, then why shouldn't they be paid?
Well, I think they should be paid, but the question is, should they necessarily be paid at some of the most generous rates that we have seen? I think what we're talking about here is we want to see the right kind of support for all farmers to be moving to nature-friendly farming. And I think that does mean public support for those public goods right across the farming sector for big farmers and small farmers. And we've got to make sure that we're using the budget appropriately. So we understand at the Wildlife Trust that it might be right to review the scheme, but to have done it like this with no warning has been really shoddy. It's produced this cliff edge, and more to the point, now it's left a big gap of uncertainty before we know what comes next. So this has almost been the worst of all worlds, the way it's being done now. We absolutely need clarity now, and I would say it needs to come from the Prime Minister and or the Chancellor to recognise that actually the farming budget, if it's spent properly on supporting nature-friendly farming, represents really good value for money.
Craig Bennett from the Wildlife Trusts. The Sustainable Farming Incentive opened in 2022, but the scheme has been evolving over the years, and some farmers say that for them, it's only more recently become an option. Tenant farmers, for instance, whose agreements with landlords made joining the early iterations of SFI difficult, or those in the uplands who also found it hard to access. Professor Julia Aglianby from Cumbria University, who's also Executive Director of the Foundation for Common Land, says because of those difficulties, many farmers hadn't yet applied.
People are feeling winded and poleaxed. It's really fascinating. People just can't believe this has happened. People are almost speechless about it. For many individuals, they just don't know what to do next. Many upland farmers were just beginning to prepare their applications, and suddenly the drawbridge has been pulled up.
Defra is saying, firstly, that there was a finite fund and that has been spent, but they're also talking about a reset for the whole of SFI, which surely would be good news for upland farmers who have found it so tricky.
Well, a lot of the issues aren't really about getting in, aren't necessarily about the scheme. They're inherent complexities of farming in the uplands. So whether you're a commoner or on a triple SI or will have a landlord, that's not going to change whatever the new scheme is. I think what's more important is whether we have confidence in schemes going forward. We know that the transition to public money for public goods is the biggest transition for 70 years, yet it's been so stop-start. So yes, the SFI has many imperfections, but what really worries me is the lack of confidence farmers will have in the direction of travel of public money for public goods. They feel they've been walked up a hill, and rather than finding a nice plateau at the top and the sunlit uplands people talk about, they've literally found a cliff.
What does this mean for farm businesses in areas like the lakes?
Looking at the upland figures, 60% of farmers' farm business income, their profit, comes from agri-environment schemes. So that's such schemes such as stewardship schemes. And so it's really important. And if farmers can't access these schemes, their businesses are going to have huge difficulties. They don't have the opportunity to intensify production because of the very nature of the land they manage, and because these are the areas that are highly designated for nature. They are delivering fantastically, and the reality is we are not rewarding them properly. This is the Lake District where 18 million people come on holiday each year, and yet the people looking after the landscape are receiving less than the minimum wage. That is not a just transition.
Professor Julia Aglianby. Well, ministers have presented their decision as good news, pointing out that there are a record number of farmers in SFI schemes and that after an underspend by the last government, they have successfully allocated the whole budget. They also, as I said, promised a reset for SFI, which will in the future direct funding to where there is the greatest potential to do more on nature and the least ability to access decent returns from agricultural markets or other sources of investment. Speaking in the House of Commons yesterday, the Farming Minister, Daniel Zeichner, defended the decision.
This decision is about investing in long-term stability. It's about a future where farmers are supported to run profitable businesses, where public money is used in a better way to better restore nature and to secure long-term food security.
Daniel Zeichner, and we will be speaking to him on tomorrow's programme. James Turner manages a farm in South Shropshire. He's one of 64 farmers in the Cleeview Farmer Cluster. They're working together across the 15,500 hectares they own or manage to improve the land, from soil and water quality to creating wildlife habitats. James says the SFI has been integral to their work.
I think we're going to have to sort of think on our feet now. I think we could potentially push up production in some aspects of the business, probably look to some private sources of funding potentially, but it certainly won't replace the level of income that farming businesses would have been able to draw out of SFI.
And do you think that across the cluster people will intensify a bit in their farming at the cost of some of the nature work you've been doing?
I certainly think that certain amount of that will go on, yes, for sure. I think things like, for example, herbal lays, which have been a popular option. I think in the absence of that option, I think people perhaps will go back to a more intensive lay, which requires sort of quite a heavy artificial fertiliser inputs to be able to produce the same amount of forage.
And what are people saying about all this?
Well, the various WhatsApp groups that I'm involved with have been people are left absolutely reeling after the announcement, partly because of the fact that the press release was written in such a way that made it sound like a sort of good news story, when actually it came as a real hammer blow to farmers who are in various different stages of the process of applying to SFI. All that work is now wasted, and we're sort of sitting here trying to plan our businesses based on a sort of vague assurance that SFI will come back in some guise, but perhaps not for about 12 months.
James Turner. More on all that tomorrow, but that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.